All right, stage 5 of the French Revolution, the age of Napoleon. I'm going to try to go quick because I just did this and it took way too long because I like talking about Napoleon. So, take 2. When Napoleon took power, France had been involved in a revolution for 10 straight years. 10 years of revolution meant 10 years of ineffective government, 10 years of violence, and 10 years of war. Napoleon was able to take power in the coup d'etat, as we saw in the last stage, because the French people were okay with him taking power. Right? It would seem like the French Revolution fought for a republican form of government, a democratic form of government, would never be okay with one person taking over complete control of the government like Napoleon did. But the French people had seen the republican forms of government they'd had in the previous 10 years of revolution be incredibly ineffective and sometimes lead to terrible things like the Reign of Terror. And so Napoleon, though he wasn't super democratic and a Republican, and he talked like a Republican, but people knew that he wanted power for himself, but at least they saw him as capable, someone who would actually make good changes inside France, because think of all the good changes he made inside the French army and all the territory he conquered. Why wouldn't he also be good at this? So Napoleon takes power because he promises a return to stability in France. He promises to start paying police to enforce the laws, which the Directory wasn't doing. He promises to reorganize the army so that the armies are all very effective, not just the one army that he's in command of. And Napoleon is going to reduce the price of bread, making a price of bread consistent and affordable for all the French people, which is a big thing. If your family's starving, you probably don't care who's in charge, as long as the person in charge is making sure that your family can have food. Napoleon also adds to the stability in France by making a deal with the Pope. This deal promised that he would respect the rights of Catholics all across France and stop their persecution. During the other French republican forms of government, many times those governments would be worried that if Catholicism was allowed in their country, certain French Catholics might be more loyal to the Pope than the Republic, and that made them decide to go and to attack Catholics to force them to give up their Catholicism. Napoleon is not as intimidated by this idea. He says he's going to stop the threat of Catholic persecution, which means Catholic people feel more stable inside their own homes and have more faith in Napoleon, who promised to protect their rights. The other thing Napoleon does that encourages stability is he writes a series of laws called the Napoleonic Code. This is the first time since 800, when Charlemagne created the country of France that we know today, that all of the laws in France affect all of the different social classes equally. There is no distinction between a noble and a peasant. Everyone gets the same punishment for stealing something. Everyone gets the same punishment for murdering someone. And this makes the French people feel like their government's a lot more fair, because your rights aren't determined by who you're born to. And that's going to be a good thing. So I want you to remember, Napoleon takes power and has power because he promises stability. Napoleon's going to rule for about 5 years under what he calls the council government of France, where he is the first of 3 consuls. He has almost all absolute power, but he still kind of cloaks what he does in this republican language, and likes that when the Senate votes for things that he also wants, so that he can say, I'm only doing it because the Senate wants to vote for it. But he had almost all the power. In 1804, there's a vote held where Napoleon asked the French people, do you want me to be emperor for life, and do you want this office to become hereditary? Meaning when Napoleon's no longer emperor, Napoleon's son will become emperor. The election happens, and the results are officially reported as overwhelmingly in favor of Napoleon becoming emperor. These results are probably a little bit doctored, but at the end of the day, more people voted for Napoleon to be the hereditary emperor of France than voted for him to not. So we move to a coronation ceremony in Notre Dame Cathedral, where all these important people from all over Europe are invited to come watch Napoleon get crowned Emperor Napoleon I of France, and even the Pope is invited. Now, in usual coronation ceremonies, the Pope will place the crown on the head of the king to signify that the power of the king is given to him by God. But at Napoleon's coronation, when the Pope approached Napoleon and Napoleon was supposed to kneel to receive the crown from the Pope, Napoleon instead took the crown from the Pope's hand and placed it on his own head. This signified that Napoleon became emperor not because of God, but due to his own successes and due to the will of the people or the consent of the governed. So this is a very big Enlightenment-style moment, because the people chose me to be the king, not God. That's a different way to see where you get your power from. After Napoleon is granted the crown and crowned Emperor of France, there's going to be a lot of wars fought in France over the next 11 years. These wars are all going to be called the Napoleonic Wars because the one consistent thing throughout all of them is Napoleon is the Emperor of France. Now, he didn't declare all these wars. A lot were declared against him, but he was the consistent person that's sort of the central figure of all these wars. Therefore, they're known as the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon and the French army eventually conquer a huge swath of territory, modern-day Germany, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Italy, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and more. I'm not going to talk about all the different wars that there are in this time period, but I will talk about a few important things. The first is a group of wars where Napoleon conquered Spain and Portugal. These are called the Peninsular Wars. These wars were incredibly costly for France. They were fought with guerrilla tactics by the Portuguese and Spanish who did not want to be controlled by the French. Napoleon calls these wars his ulcer because he had to keep sending troops to Spain and Portugal to stop the guerrilla fighting there, but he could never quite seem to send enough there to completely stop the fighting. So it was kind of like a constant source of pain for him. During the wars, one of the big enemies of France was Great Britain. Great Britain's kind of the chief opponent of France, and this was because Great Britain had lots of money, so Great Britain paid a lot of other countries to fight against France. Napoleon thought one of the best ways that he could defeat Britain then wasn't going to be a battle, because Britain's an island and France doesn't have a good navy, but he could maybe starve France out. He could maybe starve Britain out by not letting any European country on the continent of Europe to trade with Great Britain. This was called the Continental System. And if Britain doesn't have its main trading partners, then Britain will lose money. They won't be able to pay all these troops to fight against France, and then they will become weaker. The Continental System did not work, though, because not all of the countries of Europe participated the way Napoleon wanted. Chiefly, one that didn't was Russia. In 1812, Napoleon grew tired with Russia's refusal to participate in his continental system. He grew tired of Russia's refusal to stop trading with Great Britain, and so Napoleon gathered the largest army in history ever assembled at that time, 680,000 men, and prepared to invade Russia and force their participation in the system. Marching from France and into Russia, Napoleon was eventually able to conquer the capital Russian city of Moscow. When Napoleon got to Moscow, the city was completely and totally empty. The entire Russian government, the entire amount of citizens in Moscow had retreated away from Moscow and into the Russian wilderness. Napoleon thought at first, if I conquer the city, Russia will surrender, but when he got to the city and no one was there, he realized that the Russians were not going to surrender simply because a city was taken over from them. Napoleon stations his army in Moscow for a few weeks, hoping to hear from the Russian Tsar so that they can negotiate how to end this war and to force Russia to participate in the continental system. That message never comes. Eventually, someone lights a fire inside the city of Moscow, which was largely made out of wood. This fire spreads and spreads and spreads all over the city of Moscow, filled with French troops, and eventually Napoleon realizes he's going to have to retreat from Moscow because now it's almost entirely burnt down, and the Russians aren't surrendering, and the Russian winter is coming. So on the 19th of October, Napoleon decides he and his army are going to start marching home. As soon as he starts marching home, winter hits. As winter hits and Russian forces harass the French army, there's a shortage of French food. Only 40,000 of the 680,000 French troops ever return home. Napoleon eventually gets back to France in 1814, but he's hotly pursued by a giant Russian army, and Napoleon is going to have to abdicate or give up the throne in 1814, and Napoleon is going to be forced into exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba. On Elba, Napoleon's going to modernize the island. He's going to basically serve as the emperor of Elba until he gets really bored, because that Elba is just not nearly as exciting as being emperor of the French. So on February 26, 1815, Napoleon escapes Elba on a small boat headed for the southern coast of France. When he lands on the southern coast of France, the new king of France, because the Russians forced a monarchy back on the French people, is going to order a military group to arrest Napoleon as soon as he steps off the boat. Napoleon steps off the boat, sees the troops, and famously says, If there is any man among you who would kill his emperor, here I stand." Rather than shooting or arresting Napoleon, the troops break out into chants of "Long live the emperor," and Napoleon begins to march back to France with his own private army now. march back to Paris. Every town Napoleon goes through on his path through France back to Paris, his army gets a little bit bigger, and the French king, Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI, gets a little bit more nervous. Eventually, the French monarch, King Louis XVIII, is going to run away from Paris because he's terrified that Napoleon will capture and kill him when Napoleon returns. Napoleon enters Paris to the cheers of thousands of people, and he becomes Emperor of the French for 100 more days. During these 100 days, the combined might of European armies declare war against Napoleon again, saying, we can't let this dude run this continent again. We exiled him the first time. We're going to have to beat him again and exile him a second time. Eventually, at the modern-day Belgian town of Waterloo, Napoleon is going to be defeated by a British commander known as the Duke of Wellington. When Napoleon is defeated for the last time here at Waterloo, he's going to be sent to exile on the island of St. Helena's, which is way farther away than Elba. St. Helena's is essentially halfway between Brazil and Africa, so there's no chance Napoleon's coming back. When Napoleon's kicked out for the second time, a monarchy is again forced upon France, but that won't last for forever. Napoleon's reign as always kind of gets mixed reviews by historians. Some see him as the embodiment of the Enlightenment because he rewrote law codes that were fair for everyone. He modernized France and established a meritocracy, meaning you got your job because you were good at it, not because you knew somebody who could get you that job. Some see Napoleon's reign as the opposite of the revolution because he took power from the people and made himself a hereditary monarch. That's going to be for you to decide.